for settling for fighting that bingo at the senior center. And I was a full-term permanent park ranger at Rosie the River Home Front National Historical Park in Richmond, California. But I had reached that age with problems that meant that I had outlived my sense of future and was involved in grand improvisation. I was making up life 1 hour at a time. I was meeting with my attorney, going over end-of-life issues in the morning, going to work, and then coming back to an exploding life. It was intense. I spent my days as a ranger, doing things that rangers do, guiding tours. I was being involved in trainings. Of course, that takes most of our lives as rangers. Trainings in CPR, in which I was most often the victim. Trainings and with that defibrillator that's on the wall, just in case one of our visitors got in trouble. But also answering phones. And that was tricky for me, because I would answer the phone, Rosie the River Home Front National Historical Park, to a visitor or a potential visitor wanting to make reservations to hear one of my programs, because I was in the theater 3 to 5 times a week doing programs involving the history of that great place. They would say my mother or my grandmother or my grandfather heard this woman and was excited, and they would go on, and I would feel more and more embarrassed, and Betty would go more into the third person, and by the time the telephone was over, I had gotten to the reservation books, which is incidentally usually 2 or 3 months in advance. And they would say, "To whom am I speaking?" And I would say, "Helen." And this became a joke among my colleagues. So much so that on one of my birthdays, someone, my supervisor, had a new brass ID tag that I wore above my other tags, which said Helen. And Helen became the persona that did all the things that Betty didn't have the nerve enough to do. And Helen was to become a strong feature in my life. Because my family was involved in concern, and I was involved with those end-of-life issues and wondering whether living in an apartment alone was something I needed to go on doing. I had become a park ranger at the age of 85. I mean, who does that? But my sons were growing deeply concerned about the fact that I was living alone. I'd given up driving because my sight was failing. But I didn't want my kids to have to wrestle my car keys out of my hand. So my life was becoming more and more constricted. I was grateful that I had chosen to live on a second floor, in a second floor apartment, therefore safer, right? But on June 30th, I woke in the night to a presence. I realized that there was someone in my bedroom, and I turned to see a man standing not 6 feet away with a small flashlight looking through my things. I reached over to the nightstand where my cell phone was. Anyone would do that, right? To call the police. But my turning signaled him that I was awake. And within seconds, he had leaped across my bed had wrestled me out of the bed and flung my cell phone across the room. And I remember feeling grateful that neither of us was armed, because had it been a gun, it wouldn't have lasted more than 6 seconds. We wrestled in that room, the stranger and me. I screamed as loud as I could scream. He pinned my arms. My back was against his chest. And I remember, for some strange reason, realizing that my chin, my head ended at his chin, and that he was probably 5'8", 5'10". It's amazing what comes to you in times like that. We wrestled across the floor, and when we got to the door of the hallway, I suddenly realized, even though he's still screaming, but my screams were being muffled by the fact that his arm was over my mouth. And I was to learn later that no one was hearing me anyway, because the downstairs apartment was empty. But as we got to the doorway of the hallway, I reached out and kicked his leg out from under him, and we both fell. I fell with my back on the floor, and he was straddled with his knees on each side of my body, my torso. And his hands were freed up, and he was trying hard to keep me from screaming. So he was pummeling my face with his bare fists. And I suddenly realized my hands were free, and that he was wearing what was probably pajama pants, because there was a drawstring that I could feel, which meant that the family jewels were exposed. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I remembered this magical thing, and I reached it. I grabbed his balls and I squeezed as hard as I could. And magically, he toppled over the heap. And I was suddenly free. But I was right next to the bathroom door. I plunged my way through the door and sat with my back against the lavatory, and my feet propped against the door so he couldn't get into me. And suddenly, I felt safe. I listened. I couldn't hear him. I couldn't hear anything. I don't know how long that session ended, but I suddenly realized that under the lavatory was my electric iron. So I reached in, I pulled it out, stood up long enough to plug it in the wall, and turned it up to linen. I was going to brand him for the police. It was still silent. And as soon as I felt it was safe enough, decided he was gone, that my intruder was no longer there, I went in calmly, got myself into some pink pajamas, went out the front door, still with the iron in my hand, now cooling, pounded my neighbor's door, neighbors I had not met, pounded on, and suddenly, Arthur Hadley, my neighbor, who I'd never met, arrived, and he opened the door, let me in, yelling to his wife, "Call the police, Helen!" because when the police arrived, and the city officials with them, and the police department was there because I'm a pretty noted figure in my city, they offered not only counseling, but to relocate me if I needed that to happen. And I suddenly realized, despite my kids' fears, or even my own, that intruder had given me a gift. That for the first time in my life, I knew that I'd been tested, not only survived, but prevailed. And I know